Hello, and welcome to episode 21 of Sarastro's Marvel Crisis Protocol painting series. In this video, I'll be painting the Sanctum Sanctorum terrain piece from Atomic Mass Games' Marvel Crisis Protocol. The Sanctum Sanctorum is a really beautiful model, with lots of room for artistic interpretation. For mine, I've aimed to create a nicely weathered look to match the rest of my terrain, along with a slightly dark and mysterious atmosphere. You can see that I've also created a scenic tile for the building to sit on. For more details on my process there, you can refer to my original urban terrain scenery video, and watch out for some future content from me on the topic. I'll be painting the Sanctum in two broad phases. I'll first be priming the model before sketching in all of the values and textures using a grayscale with both the brush and sponge. I'll then provide the colour on top, using mostly transparent layers to allow the values underneath to show through. I'll also be creating some gentle object source lighting effects for the lanterns on the front, and I'll be giving some extra attention to the skylight on the roof. We'll also have a quick look at some of the smaller scenic pieces that come with the set. Let's begin. Assembly of the model is nice and simple. I'm keeping the main sections of the building separate for now, and I'll also be leaving off the smaller elements such as the decorative face and the lanterns. Here I'm just using some white tack to cover the joins to allow me to glue plastic to plastic later on. I'm now priming the entire model in black with the airbrush, and you could of course use a rattle can primer here instead if you like. Notice that I'm doing this with adjacent sections of the building dry fitted together, just to help keep primer off the joins. I'm now going to provide some zenithal highlights using Vallejo's Cold Grey. This could also be done with a rattle can grey, provided you keep the application quite light so as to avoid overspraying the model. Once again, you can see that I'm dry fitting adjacent sections of the building whilst I work. This is to ensure that I don't end up over-lightening parts of the building that really ought to be in shadow, such as here beneath this ledge. Finally, I've decided to go a little brighter still by mixing in some white ink. This isn't vital, however, as I'll be playing around with the values using a sponge and brush in a moment. I'm quite keen to achieve a nice gradient here on the roof, and also to hit the tops of these jutting out windows. I'm also gently lightening the brickwork, and here I'm placing some initial pools of light where the lanterns are going to go. Now that we've achieved a nice pattern of values, I'm going to sharpen the details and add some texture. For that, I'm going to first do some dry brushing using a nice heavy body white. I'm using the extra large dry brush by Rosemary & Co, but a cheap makeup brush would also be fine. This is a great way to sharpen the texture and definition of the brickwork and all of the main edges. We can also use a standard brush to place some nice strong edge highlights to places like these arched windows. I'm now mixing in varying amounts of black and using a piece of sponge to begin adding some texture to the stonework. I'm working quite freely with the tones and layers, and you can see that I'm getting darker towards the base of the building. Here I'm once again sketching in some object source lighting where the lamps are going to go. And for the harder to reach places, I'm switching back to the dry brush. I'm now continuing to play with the textures and values, working my way up the building as I go. You can see I'm adding a limited amount of texture to the brickwork, and I'm doing some further strengthening of the edge highlights. Here on the roof, I'm playing with some more streaky textures by pulling the sponge downwards. We can also push the values to really help accentuate the geometry and volumes. Now that I'm happy with the pattern of values and texture, let's begin adding some colour. I'm going to begin with the railings on the roof, where I'm going to apply some Gryph-Charger Grey along with a little black Templar to achieve a bluish-black metallic look. I might also throw on a few patches of Guilliman Flesh just to add a little tonal variety. This is the Gryph-Charger Grey, and for a super quick result, there'd be nothing wrong with leaving the railings like this. I'm now adding some black Templar to the more shadowed area at the base. And here I'm adding a few random patches of the Guilliman Flesh. We can simply rub the paint away from the places we want to appear highlighted. Once dry, I'm now thinning some Aethermatic Blue, and I'm using this to add a little vibrancy to the more highlighted areas. And here I've chosen to apply some Magos Purple to the lower part of the main transition on the railings to create an attractive bit of colour modulation. This is all pretty optional, however. Finally, I'm using some white mixed with a little dark sea blue to add some quick edge highlights. I'm now moving on to the roof, where I'm using Vallejo's foul green along with some dark sea blue for the shadows. I'm also going to prepare some black and some white in case I need to adjust the saturation. I've chosen to thin the paint with some glaze medium to make it easier to work in translucent layers, as well as to extend the drying time. I'm first testing the colour out on the flat part of the roof, adjusting the consistency on the fly to ensure we get enough of the underlying texture showing through. I'm now wet blending in a little dark sea blue and maybe a touch of black for the shadowed edges and corners. I'm pretty pleased with the look, so I'm now continuing round the rest of the roof in the same way. If your first layer appears a little too thin, we can simply apply a second to boost the saturation. For the smaller areas surrounding the windows, I'm applying the paint a little more thickly to give me a bit more control over the tone, and I'm mixing dark, mid and light tones to paint each of the main facets of the design. Once dry, I've decided to apply some thinned Guilliman Flesh to add some gentle patches of streaking, along with a little variation of tone. And I'm now using some brown ink to really add definition to all of the joins and grooves. Here I'm just playing with a thin glaze of the Magos Purple for the mid and shadow tones, again just to introduce a little further colour variation. And finally, I'm mixing in some white along with some ice yellow to add some nice strong edge highlights. I'll be returning to paint the remaining details on the roof in a while. For the brickwork, I'm using a 2-to-1 mix of Guilliman Flesh and Magos Purple, and I'm going to mix in some Gryph-Charger Grey for the shadows. So this is my Guilliman Flesh and Magos Purple mix. And I'm now wet blending in some of the Gryph-Charger Grey for the shadowed area beneath the roof. Here I'm just soaking the paint up off some of the bricks to create a bit of random variation. For the patches of light at the front, I've thinned the paint with contrast medium to preserve more of the underlying values. To create some further variation, we can mix in a darker tone like Wyldwood and pick out a few random bricks. And here I'm using pure Gryph-Charger Grey. For a final bit of colour interest, I'm once again drawn to the Magos Purple. These purple tones in the brickwork will also set up a subtle bit of complementary contrast with the slightly yellowish tone I'll be using for the lights near the doorway. Moving on to the windows, I'm first adding a couple of drops of black Templar to some Gryph-Charger Grey, and I'm using this to cover the iron frames as well as the glass panels. I'm also using this for the lamps, taking care to avoid the panels if possible. And here I'm adding some preliminary colour to the railings at the front, as well as the street signs. For the panes of glass, I'm now going to simply brush over some thinned Huldra blue. I quite like being able to see the irregular patterns left by the contrast colour showing through here. You could go further and hand draw some individual reflections here if you like, but given the sheer number of windows, I decided to keep things nice and simple. For the windows on the roof, however, I decided to sketch in some reflections of the sky in the upper panes of the glass using white. This can be pretty loose and sketchy, and we don't even need a solid, even layer. I'm then once again going over this with some thinned Huldra blue. A second layer can be added to create some variations in the levels. Next I'm going to do some optional tidying up of the metal window frames using a bluish grayscale made of black, white and dark sea blue, and I might add some ivory for the brightest highlights. I'm firstly using quite a dark grey for the inner sides of the frames. And something a bit lighter for the upturned ledges. and lastly I'm adding some pretty bright highlights to the outer edges. Next I'm going to paint the stonework, and for that I've chosen Thar Brown for my main mid-tone, which I'll be darkening with some black for the shadows, and I'll be using some Mojave White for the highlights. I'm starting with Thar Brown mixed with black, which I'm using for the upper shadowed parts of the recessed surrounds of each window. I'm then moving closer to Thar Brown for the sides. And for these curved archways, I'm feathering out the transition with a damp brush. This is now pure Thar Brown, which I'm using for parts that I feel would catch the most light. For larger areas like this where we want to preserve the textures, I might go with a thinner consistency. I'm now using the Mojave White to push the highlights further, especially for those sharp edge highlights. I'm also using the Thar Brown and Mojave White for the stone columns on the roof. And I might use a nice heavy body cream tone like this vanilla white to really sharpen those edges. I'm now using a large flat brush to apply these same tones somewhat thinly to the lower part of the building. And if things start looking a little too smooth, we can always bring back a little texture with the sponge. I'm once again going extra thin for the patches of light here at the front. And I'm now painting the remaining areas of stone, including the steps. For the door, I chose to play around with a reddish-brown tone, initially using a mix of dark brown ochre, red ochre, and a little black. And first achieving a base tone that I'm happy with, then doing a little dark lining around the panels. I'm now adding some vanilla yellow to pick out some edge highlights. I'm also sketching in the little object source lighting, which I'll be refining later on once the lanterns are in place. I'm now using vanilla white to paint the glass of the lanterns. Something like Vallejo's Ivory would also be fine for this. And here I'm just dry fitting them to the wall to see how things look. Next I'm going to provide some highlights to the handrail, lanterns and the door handles, using the same tones we used for the window frames. I want these highlights to be quite sharp to give the impression of glinting light from the lanterns. I'm also sharpening the highlights on the door. For the sculpted face that goes above the door, I'm starting with a dark brown base tone, using a mix of dark brown ochre and burnt sienna umber. I'll then highlight up with some vanilla yellow and vanilla white. You can see that I'm imagining quite a bit of light coming up from the nearby lanterns. To finish the face off, I've decided to add a little verdigris weathering with the foul green before gluing it into place. I've now chosen to give a gentle yellow boost to the lanterns by heavily thinning out some Iyanden Yellow with medium. I'm also using this to gently tint the surrounding area where I imagine the light would hit. Notice I'm only after a very subtle shift here. And I'm now gluing the lanterns into place. Next I'm going to return to the roof, where I'm first painting the hatch door using a mid-brown tone from the palette, followed with some dark lining. And I'm once again using the bluish grayscale for the metal details. I'm now going to paint the skylight, and I'm starting by drawing a rough silhouette of the horizon in black at the lower part of the window. Next I'm going to sketch in the values for the reflection of the sky using some pale greys. I'm pretty much improvising here, but you can see I'm getting a little darker towards the edges. For the raised design, I've picked out some colours to create a non-metallic gold effect, ranging from the dark brown ochre and burnt sienna umber for the shadows, to raw sienna and Naples yellow for the midtones, and vanilla yellow and vanilla white for the highlights. You can of course use whatever gold tones you're most familiar with. Rather than start with a dark base tone and gradually highlight up, I've chosen to jump straight in with a loose sketch using the full range of colours. This might involve doing a bit of wet blending and playing with the consistencies of the paint. I know that I'd like my brightest region to be roughly off-centre, but beyond that I'm just playing around quite freely with my placement of light and shade. Generally, for the sharp, brighter highlights such as on the edges, I'm keeping the paint quite thick, but will go thinner when blending. Now I've got my initial sketch in place, I'm going to brush some Huldra blue over the panes of glass. You can see the paint is pretty thin, which will allow me to build up the intensity in multiple layers, getting a little darker towards the edges. I'm now brightening up this central spot of light with some white, then glazing a little of the vanilla yellow on top. Next I'm returning to the gold, where I'm going to spend quite a bit of time refining the look. This involves varying the frequency and layout of the little reflections and highlights, as well as sharpening all of the edges. Here I'm applying some thin dark lining where the design meets the glass. And I want the raised edges to be nice and bright. It's really up to you how textured you want this to be. You could have lots of sketchy stipples and scratches, or an ultra smooth look, or anything in between. Some small specular glints can also look quite effective. Here I played with the idea of using some foul green and dark sea blue to create the impression of light reflecting from the nearby roof. I'm also adding some small glints and reflections to the glass. And we can freely add some additional thin layers of the blue. Boosting the vibrancy of the gold with a glaze of the thinned Iyanden Yellow is also an option. and this is just a little reflection of the rim in the glass. Now that I'm happy with the skylight, I'm adding a few final touches to the rest of the building, including some additional edge highlights for the brickwork using a light skin tone. I'm also adding a few small scuffs and scratches to the door. On a whim, I also decided to glaze a little of the foul green into some of the stonework. And here I'm giving a final boost to some of the highlights on the windows. I'm also adding a little extra weathering to the roof. Before adding the Sanctum to the board, I'm throwing a little colour onto the mailbox and newsstand using some of the Scalecolor blues, along with the secret weapon rust tones. I'm also painting the street sign, and for the actual street names, I simply prepared an image in Photoshop to print out and glue down with PVA, which you can grab a copy of in the video description if you like. Once I've got the building on the board, I also couldn't resist extending out the light onto the surrounding pavement. And as detailed in my urban terrain tutorial, I also magnetised the scatter terrain where possible. And this completes the Sanctum Sanctorum. Thank you for joining me, I hope you've enjoyed the episode. As always, you can visit the video description for product lists and various links to where I can be found online. My sincerest thanks go to my amazing patrons for supporting this work. If you'd like to help fund future videos, you can hit the Patreon link to find out more. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Marvel Crisis Protocol. Happy painting!